Many different energy sources are available. Each has its own advantages and its disadvantages. Today on From the Stacks, we will speak with Dr. Ronan Connolly from Ireland about the advantages and disadvantages of the various different energy sources. We'll pay particular attention to coal, oil, natural gas, and to wind, solar, biofuels. Uh, and how these compare with each other depends very much on the priorities that policymakers have for different objectives, different goals, like slowing global warming or protecting biodiversity or delivering affordable and reliable electricity or overcoming poverty. What you learn may surprise you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Cal Beisner. I'm the founder and director founder and president and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We're a network of just under 70 Christian scholars, natural scientists, economists, policy wonks, philosophers and theologians, and so on, working to educate the public and policymakers on three things together: biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the very poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. We every month we offer a special gift as our way of saying thank you for a 100% tax deductible donation to the Cornwall Alliance. This month, our gift is The Weaponization of Weather in the Phony Climate War by Joe Bastardi. Joe is a legendary weather forecaster and weather historian, and in fact, we had him on the program last week on From the Stacks. So if you haven't seen that, you might go again to either our YouTube or our Facebook channel and see that one. It was a rollicking good time that we had. Uh, you can receive a free copy of The Weaponization of Weather simply by making a donation of any size to the Cornwall Alliance and asking for it and mentioning promo code 20-10. So just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, make a donation of any size, and request the weaponization of weather and mention promo code 20-10. Uh, Megan Kennard, who usually is with us on the program, was not able to join us this evening. She's the one who tracks the questions and comments that are put up on Facebook as we do the program. But if you do have questions, we'd welcome you still to go ahead and post those there in the comments field. And after the show, we will try to get to those and post answers to them right there. So today we get into the nitty gritty of competing energy sources in a world concerned about man-made global warming. Our special guest is Dr. Ronan Connolly. He's an independent scientist, environmentalist, and writer, and co-author of an important new article, Energy and Climate Policy: An Evaluation of Global Climate Change Expenditure 2011 to 2018, that was published last month in the online open access journal, Energies. Dr. Connolly's PhD is in computational chemistry and polymer physics, and in 2009, he began systematically investigating climate change. In 2018, he began working full-time on his climate change and environmental research through a new international research group, the Center for Environmental Research and Earth Sciences, at ceres.com. That's CERES hyphen science.com. Ceres-science.com. Ronan is working on a book about bridging the political divide on climate change and has described himself to me as on the left politically, which makes some of his views surprising on this subject. So, Ronan, welcome to From the Stacks. We're glad to have you.
Well, thank you for having me on. I'm delighted to talk about this new paper of ours. So,
Okay.
um,
Well, before we dive into the subject, Ronan, would you just tell us a bit more about yourself, your background, some of your key priorities in life, what SeriesScience.com is all about, and what got you interested in doing deep research into the pros and cons of competing energy sources?
okay, well, we could probably talk for an hour on any one of those topics. But just kind of briefly, okay. I a lot of my main interest in is as a scientist and also as an environmentalist. So when I finished my PhD, I began working with my father, who's also a scientist, Dr. Michael Connolly, and he's also an environmentalist. And we began working on um, trying to solve a lot of the problems related with overfishing and wastewater, trying to develop sustainable
Hmm.
methods of fish farming and wastewater treatment, and also looking at better forms of insulation, better building products, and everything to do. So basically, environment um, and ecology and everything like this. And then we were working on that for quite a while, and my father's still working on that, and I work with him part time on it. But around 2009, 2010, uh, we kind of started to say, you know, everybody is all concerned about like if you're say when I would introduce myself as an environmentalist, people would say, oh, you're working on climate change, you're trying to stop global warming, so tell us all about that. It's like, well, actually working on different fields in environmentalism. um, so he said, well, but probably it's worth investigating it. So myself and my father, we said, let's just kind of look at this. And I because we're here talking about this new paper, I'll just, I won't say too much about what we did, but if anyone's interested, if you go to my personal website, ronanconnellyscience.com, you can kind of get an idea of what I was finding, our work that we discovered, and
Yeah.
basically, my approach to science is that I could probably, I should say a little bit about what I've noticed is that there's a kind of a perception that's maybe the Hollywood version of science, where
Mm.
people, they put on a white lab coat and they look into a microscope and they find the answer. And it's just there. And then once you found the answer, then tick and move on to the next problem. And um, the reality is science isn't like that at all. Science is a way of trying to find answers, but you don't, you know, there are different research routes that you can do for tackling any given problem. And
Hmm.
depending on the approach you go, you can actually end up with slightly different answers, and sometimes completely different answers. So if you're using computer models, or you're using theoretical approaches, or you're maybe reading the literature, we say the literature as in other scientific publications, or maybe you carry out your own experiments, you may end up with different results. And the it's kind of what's fascinating about science is that there isn't a clear answer on any of these issues. So when it came to looking at climate, I think if we move to this particular paper that we just done,
Hmm.
um, yeah, well, oh, I should mention because you asked me about Seri science. So up until 2018, I was working with myself and my father, um, and on our main research on the environmentalism, and as a hobby. we were doing climate science. Um,
Uh-huh.
but we, it's and Michael is still doing that. He's a co-author on this paper, but uh, we had reached out to started collaborating with different scientists and realized we had a lot of work that needed to be done. So we said, but the problem is, if you are doing science looking for uh, research funding, you need to normally you apply for a grant for a very specific project, and you need to get that typically from the government to tell you tell them this is what we are going to do. And you kind of, for the next 3 to 5 years, and you kind of, if you want to get another grant, you need to ensure that you kind of got those answers. So you really aren't able to do proper investigation into, like what I was describing earlier, of saying, well, we don't know what the answers are, we don't know where this is going. And so myself and another colleague, Dr. Willie Soon, we'd been working with him on a number of papers, and we said, look,
Yeah.
we want to work full time on doing all of this, but we can't be doing this by just applying for different things. So we said, can we set up a group? So we set up seriscience.com, and basically we will follow science where it goes. And
Hmm.
so we don't have a fixed other than try and find out answers on what the science is saying. So in order to do that, we are relying on donations from people. So if anybody is interested in
Hmm.
donating to it, if you go to science.com, there's a link down to a PayPal, and you can make donations to try and do it. But one of the things that I'll say is anybody donating to this has zero impact on what we're doing, because we're just following it where it goes. So
Yeah.
we don't even know what we will be researching 3 months from now or 6 months from now. So, uh, we think that that's how science should be. I think if you know what you will be studying 3 years from now, then you're not really doing deep science. So,
Hmm.
uh, did that
Okay.
answer your questions?
That's great. That's great. And I think what you were emphasizing there in part was the importance of scientists being independent.
Yeah,
Even the American President Dwight Eisenhower back in the 1960 in his or 1961 actually his farewell address warned of the problem of science becoming overly dependent on government grants because
mm,
government of course is always it's always pursuing political ends, and that means what it wants to fund is going to be politically determined. Similarly, with big businesses tend to have particular ends in mind, and they're going to fund the people who give them the answers they want to hear. So what you're doing is going totally independent. So
yeah,
let's turn now to this new article, Energy and Climate Policy: An
right.
Evaluation of Global Climate Change Expenditure 2011 to
Yeah.
2018, which was published just last month. Now, before we get into details on that, and I should warn the audience in advance, this is a long article and tremendous amount of detail in it. And so we're only going to be really addressing about the first half of it in today's program, and even that at only a comparatively superficial level. But I think there's still a lot of really valuable information that we'll get here. But before we start to dive into some specifics, what would you say, Ronan, would have been the most controversial findings in that article, the things that would be most likely to generate anger, uh, personal attack by the folks who disagree with you?
Well, okay. Like the word controversial. I, I, I would say actually. asking any question about any of these energy sources that are politically correct or that are
Mm.
politically incorrect, that in itself seems to be controversial. It's which is in
Yes.
itself kind of why we felt it was important to do this paper. One of the things that we did, this particular paper, it's kind of a I don't know if your viewers are familiar with the concept of what's called a meta-analysis. Um, so a
Hmm.
meta-analysis is where you get um, other papers and you kind of look at them and say, okay, this is what all of these different studies are finding. And now can we kind of
Hmm.
summarize and compile together, collate the findings of all of those different papers? And um, there are different forms of meta-analysis, but largely that's kind of what we did, because the strange thing is most of the things in this paper are just describing what is in the published peer-reviewed literature. Um, and that that is the results of that are quite surprising if you are relying on what you've seen in your social media channels, what you hear on the news channels, what you hear from environmental advocacy groups,
Hmm.
and even what you hear from politicians. Because people are. Oh, there's a, I think it was an American humorist, Arnold Glasow. He used to write for Reader's Digest, but one of the things he said is, the fewer the facts, the stronger the opinion. And uh,
Right. Right.
I, I found that actually seems to hold quite true here. So, unfortunately, as you've alluded to, there's a lot of facts in this paper. So when you if you make your way through the full review paper, which it's open access, and uh, I don't know if it'll be linked to, but if you go to ronanconnellyscience.com, you can find links to all of my papers, including this latest one
Yeah.
and other stuff on it. But there should be a lot if someone could directly access this paper. But
Yeah.
it's quite a long paper, and what I would say is that if you read through the paper, your opinions at the end will probably be less strong than when you started. And I think that that is a good thing. And you asked what's the most controversial. Really, for me, the main result is that none of the sources that we are using, that we have access to, main electricity and also fuel and heat forms of energy, none of them are a panacea. They all have problems.
Yeah.
Um, but they also have, so all of them have pros and cons. And the way I would put it is like, if you imagine you're watching it, say a news broadcast, and along comes on a, um, a an advocate for, say, the nuclear lobby, and they start going on about
Hmm.
how safe and wonderful nuclear energy is and how amazing it is, and they describe all of the pros and none of the cons. You would be right to say, well, they're biased because they're nuclear lobbyists. Same if you have a
Hmm.
coal lobbyist come on, an oil lobbyist, a gas lobbyist. So whenever one of them comes on and promotes it, everyone correctly says, but of course you'd say that because you're promoting that. But strangely, if somebody comes on promoting wind farms or solar or biomass, then we're like, well, let's listen to them because they're green energy. And if I could get anything, if you could take anything out of this paper, just one rule of thumb, it's apply the same skepticism that you would apply when you hear a nuclear lobbyist promoting nuclear, or an oil
Yeah.
lobbyist promoting oil, that you would do when you hear somebody promoting wind or solar or biomass or geothermal or any of these things. That's it. If a sales
Yeah.
guy is trying to sell you something, bear in mind they're
Yeah.
trying to sell you something.
Yeah, yeah. A philosopher of science, Robert Merton, said back in 1938 that in most institutions, skepticism is viewed as something of a fault, but in science,
Yeah,
skepticism is a virtue. So,
yeah,
all right. So,
yeah.
uh, did you hope in this article to to influence public policy in any particular way? Not necessarily in any direction, but did you hope that that policymakers, if they were to read this article, or if their staff, if their staff were to read this
Yeah,
article,
yeah.
since very few elected officials ever do that for themselves, what would you hope would be the results for elected officials setting energy and environmental policy?
Well, okay. Like, and you mentioned at the beginning that that like I'm left wing, and I know that a lot of your audience would disagree with me politically, and so this and several of the
Which is
we have
fine,
it
by the
on
way.
the yeah, and you see, this is the thing. You see left wing, right wing, all of these different political ideologies have different ways of approaching problems. So, like, I I'm kind of neutral on which one, if you have a particular politician that has particular things that they want to promote, then, like, you can disagree with them politically or not, but that's the thing. But what I've found is that a lot of people believe that they are promoting ideas that are science based and that are protecting the environment. And so the thing is, if a politician or policymaker, uh, if they are considering that their policies should be science based, or that they should be concerned about the environment, then I hope that they actually read what we're finding and realize that it's not as simple as they had been, as the promoters of particular technologies they might have been talking to were
Yeah,
saying. And I say that, as I said, it applies to all promoters of a particular energy
yeah,
industry. Yeah,
yeah. I think that's one of the most valuable things about your article is simply that rather than going forth to try to try to push one particular technology or another, what you're doing is you're looking at all of the pros and cons of all the different options, and not just sort of in an abstract way, but saying, okay, if your main priority as a politician is to reduce air pollution, well, here are the
yeah,
pros and cons of this technology and that one. If your main priority
yeah,
is to promote economic development for the poor, then here are the pros and
yeah,
cons, and they may differ very greatly,
yeah,
uh,
yeah,
depending on the priorities of the politician in mind, or
yeah,
the policymaker in mind. Well, the
yeah,
abstract of your article points out that roughly $3.7 trillion has been spent on global climate change projects over the period 2011 to 2018. Now, that sounds like an enormous amount of money, and it is, but I do want to provide some sense of proportion lest folks think it's too outrageous. That amount, $3.7 trillion, is just over half of 1% of total gross world product for those years. So it's not devastating. Nonetheless,
yeah,
it is a lot of money, and 55% of it, or about $1.85 trillion, has gone to wind and solar energy. And yet, even after all this, the contribution of wind and solar to world energy consumption has increased from just 0.5% to just about 3% over that period. Meanwhile, coal, oil, and natural gas, the fossil fuels, continue to supply 85% of all the world's energy consumption, with hydroelectricity and nuclear providing most of the remainder. Give
Yeah.
us some sense of proportion about this spending, Ronan. How much bang for the buck is the world getting from its spending on wind and solar, and what impact has that had on global carbon dioxide emissions, and therefore, assuming that carbon dioxide is a significant contributor to global temperature, how much of an impact has that had on global temperature?
Okay, well, you've a couple of different things to unpack there. I
Yeah.
guess I'll start because I see you have the graph up here on the figures. So part of what we tried to do in this paper was we said, let's try and rely on try and look at what other people are doing, because one of the big things that is scientists you you and recognize is that uh, scientists have their own biases. Everybody, we're people, scientists are people just the same. Everybody has a bias. And what I will often say is,
Hmm.
if you think you're unaffected by confirmation bias or any others, then you probably are. So instead of assuming that you're unbiased, if you can try and figure out ways to step back from your own personal biases. And
Hmm.
this is it. So we, one of the inspirations for this thing was it's fascinating work done by a group called the Climate Policy Initiative, and they've been
Hmm.
issuing these reports since. They actually started in 2009, but their first report, they were finding it hard to do. They did a whole restructuring of how to analyze this, and it's actually incredibly difficult to work out exactly how much is being spent on climate change. Um, they have done what we feel is probably what we found is seems to be the most comprehensive, but even they are saying it is probably it's a lower bound of what's been spent. And then you
Hmm.
said, yeah, it's as a percentage, of the world's GDP, it's quite small. And in fact, they actually say that because Climate Policy Initiative, they are calling for more investment
Yes.
into climate change. And so they were saying, here's what's been spent. Can we leverage this upwards? Because they feel they want to meet Paris Agreement targets and things like that. And they were saying, so they're looking and they're seeing the same as what we're finding. This is making no difference to CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions have increased. Um, CO2 emissions, there's been a bigger decrease. The only decrease in CO2 emissions that has been noticeable is because of this COVID thing. Nothing to do with wind farms or solar. But other than that, up to 2018, certainly where the data goes, CO2 emissions were rising. Um, so they continue to rise even as this has been going down. So the Climate Policy Initiative, in their latest reports, they specifically said, "Oh well, we should, really, we should be looking for at least uh, 1 to 3 trillion a year should be being spent on climate change expenditure." Um, but that kind of prompted us when we at least had figures, because they give a breakdown of how it's been spent, and as you saw in that pie chart, it's it's more than
Hmm.
half is going on to wind and solar. And then if you look at the other things, um, we have um, energy efficiency, sustainable transport, and there's a thing called climate adaptation, which, if we have time, we might talk about later. But like climate adaptation, in my opinion, would be a far better expenditure. But like the wind and solar, they're the popular ones. They're very politically correct. in terms of everybody seems to think they're green and useful. It as you say, it hasn't really. They have increased from 0.5% to 3%, according
Yeah.
to the BP reports and to various other reports assessing how much renewables are.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd actually love for you to go ahead and just develop your comment about climate change adaptation as distinct from climate change mitigation.
Yeah.
Because although I hadn't planned on our talking about that right now, I actually think it's a very, very important thing. Uh, so go ahead and build on that, maybe particularly pointing to the fact that, climate change mitigation all depends on a particular theory as to what's driving climate change, whereas climate change adaptation, really, it doesn't matter what's driving climate change. We need to adapt regardless. And
Yeah.
so maybe there are some advantages to that. Would you build on that a bit?
Okay. Well, actually, if anybody is particularly interested, and I like my thoughts on this were very influenced by years back. There was a paper in 2015 by Professor Roger Pilkey Jr. And
Yes.
he
Yes.
since has written a book, which is quite a short one, called "The Climate Fix," and
Yes.
like I disagree with him on some things and agree with him on others, but it's a very readable book that makes you. It is worth a read and it's quite straightforward. But basically,
Yeah.
um, he was pointing out that the UN. So I'm not sure how familiar, probably some of your viewers I know a little bit about the history of climate change policies, but starting around the late 1980s, um, the, there was international concern based on uh, computer model
Hmm.
predictions that were saying that climate change that was due to carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and that the CO2 was the primary driver of past and future climate, and that it was increasing and was going to lead to very unusual global warming. And on the basis of these computer model predictions, and a couple of scientists like Dr. James Hansen in NASA, he was saying we need to do this. So the UN set up a organization to try and deal with um, reducing uh, carbon dioxide emissions and stopping future climate change. And this was to be a political international negotiations. So after a few years, you might have heard of the COP agreement, COP, Conference of the Parties. So the first one was in 1992, but there was a whole series of them. They're every year. So 2015, you had in
Yeah.
1996 or 7, you had the Kyoto. It was based in Kyoto, and you had the Kyoto Protocol. Then you had the Paris Agreement. So these meetings every
Yeah.
year, they are all looking at how to how to stop climate change from the human modification of the atmosphere. And
Right.
that was decided in the early 1990s in what was called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Those are
Yeah.
UNFCCC.
In fact,
Uh, yeah,
we had one of our programs just focused a few weeks ago, I guess about a month ago, on the UNFCCC and what are the
yeah,
pros and the cons of
yeah.
that. So
Yes. Okay. Well. So you probably you've heard a little bit about it, and certainly you have. Um,
yeah.
the separately, the UN also said, well, having all of these political negotiations continuing, we probably should have it based on science. And so they said, can we get a group of scientists to put on the lab coat and look under the microscope and tell us, uh, just check that what we're doing is correct. So they set up what is called this was in conjunction with the World Meteorological Organization. It's the UN/WMO, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. So the
Right.
IPCC reports, their official mandate is to try and explain the causes. Like, in particular, they are split up into three groups. And the main one that is of interest to me, that I focused on mostly, is called the Physical Science Working Group, which
Right.
their main remit is, what do we know about the causes of past and present climate change, and what can we say about future climate change? But to them, climate change is a change in the climate. It doesn't say anything about the causes of it. But the UNFCCC, which is what the international negotiations are going on, explicitly define climate change as, well, you can look it up the exact term, but it's something basically to
As
say
human induced.
any change in the climate that is caused by, directly or indirectly, by human modification of the atmosphere. So basically,
Right.
greenhouse gases. So they define, according to the UNFCCC, climate change is defined as being
Yeah.
human caused. And it's defined as being caused by greenhouse gas emissions. So when you hear scientists agree, say 97% of scientists agree that the climate is changing, and includes me, um, then uh, and then you say, well,
Me too.
we've defined climate change as being due to, well, then you get you're changing the terminology. And
Right.
politically, it made sense, because if you get politicians and international policymakers to be trying to figure out how to uh, how to reduce climate change when it's, say, caused by changes in solar variability, well, I don't know how you can tax the sun. Um, you know, so it's kind of a bit difficult to do that. So they
Yeah.
have gone with an easier, in some senses, easier problem. They're saying the UNFCCC defines climate change as being caused by
Hmm.
carbon dioxide. And so what you'll find is all of these policies, government policies that are inspired by the Paris Agreement or the Kyoto general UN policies, they are assuming, either implicitly or explicitly, that climate change is it is mostly or entirely due to CO2 emissions. Now, so Pelkey Jr. pointed out that this has meant that there is a very strong bias towards uh, climate change policies to try and minimize the negative effects of climate change, to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, particularly CO2 emissions. So this is called climate change mitigation. So mitigating
Right.
the future by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But the climate has always been changing, regardless of your positions on how much is natural versus human caused. If you are trying to, uh, if you live in a hurricane zone, and you're like, there's a hurricane coming, what do we do? Quick, everybody take out the the recyclable light bulbs, and as quickly as possible before the hurricane hits us. it's a very inefficient way. Even if you do believe that climate change is mostly human caused and mostly due to greenhouse gases, if a hurricane is coming to you, and you know that there will be hurricanes, might not know when it is, but if you're in the Caribbean, or if you're in the Gulf, along say Florida or Texas, and you're like, you don't know when there will be another hurricane, but you know there will be one, and if so, you want to so do what's called climate change adaptation. So climate change adaptation is saying, look, the climate is changing. Can we um, can we try and see if we can better deal with, say, weather extremes? So if you believe that sea levels are
Mhm.
rising precipitously, can we manage that by doing it? Or if you're getting a lot of rainfall, counterintuitively, you'll have a lot of policies to try and protect against sea levels, actually
Mhm.
reduce the drainage. So we have this in Ireland. We have like problems where they introduce seawalls, worried about a 2 millimeter a year rise in sea levels. They built these massive seawalls in a particular bit just beside this is Clontarf Road, or Fairview. They now, despite the recommendations of engineers who said this is like a sub bit here, if you do that, there'll be drainage problems. So
Yeah.
when the next storms came along, the entire road is now regularly flooded. So now they've had to put
So
holes
rather
back
than
into the seawall.
yeah, rather than keeping the sea out, it keeps the rain in, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's all of these
So
problems, but you
yeah,
but
in
but the
essence,
point is,
the issue is
yeah,
that if we what we spend on adaptation, on being able to protect against various climate change results,
yeah,
what we spend on adaptation will protect us no matter what causes the climate change.
yeah,
Whereas what we
yeah.
spend on climate change mitigation only helps if indeed what's causing climate change is what folks have thought was causing climate change.
I,
So
and
there's
it's
kind of
also the
a
key
safety net
point.
there.
The key point is as well that it is a indirect mechanism of doing it. What you're saying is,
Right.
if we reduce CO2 emissions by 20%, um, this year and the next year and the next year, in 20 years, we will have partially reduced the rise in CO2. And by the way, all of the people living in drought regions and all of these, you know, because we didn't invest the
They're
money
still
in
suffering.
trying to actually, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah. So that's it. So
Yeah.
adaptation art,
Okay.
here's that, because I know that a lot of your channel has a kind of more of a religious emphasis to it, but like, just if you were looking in when Joseph went to the Pharaoh, sought his advice,
Uh-huh.
uh, of the 7 years, he was saying we're having droughts and we're having good times now, but we might have drought. This I like. I'm not. You have the seven fat calves and all of this stuff here, and the
Right.
seven skinny calves. So that region where the Pharaoh was, and where Joseph came from, that includes the region like Syria. So Syria at the moment is having climate change problems. And had, like, several years ago, had massive droughts, the same as it did back in the Old Testament. So, and in
Hmm.
the Old Testament, he was saying, well, you should be planning for, we're having
Right.
good times now, but you're going to get,
Yeah.
effectively, there will be climate change in 7 years. I don't know whether it was literally seven
Yeah.
years. I don't know how reliable his
Yeah.
computer climate model global climate models he had. But he was saying, look, we need to plan for that period. And
Yeah.
then what happened was that Egypt was the only one, according to the Old Testament, Egypt was the only place that actually had stockpiled all of the stuff.
Mm.
And so the the Jews came to were taken in because they couldn't survive where
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah.
Well, according to
Uh,
that seems to be in the Old Testament. So
okay.
adaptation
Now,
before, that's Old Testament adaptation, and it's
right.
still the same now. Just imagine what if you
Still a good idea.
compare a pharaoh. If you could compare what a pharaoh's version of climate change adaptation to uh, to 5% of $2 trillion over, if they
Yes.
could increase that, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
adaptation.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We have actually just about 15 or 20 minutes left,
Oh,
and
okay,
we're only
okay,
barely getting started here. So we're going to need to try to whip through the rest of these reasonably quickly.
okay.
One point that you and your co-authors make is that cheap and abundant fossil fuel energy has driven the Industrial Revolution, and so it's been a key factor in enabling the development of the current high-income nations. Now, most people think of the Industrial Revolution as something that happened basically from the late 1700s to the early 1900s, and so, hey, they figure it's over, so now it's time to move on. We don't need to continue using dirty fossil fuels. We should learn to use the clean fuels of the present and the future instead. Is
Yeah.
that sensible, and how would you respond to that?
Well, I at the beginning, to avoid repetition because we're running out of time, but if you recall, I was saying, as soon as if you applied the same skepticism that you do when you hear an oil lobbyist promoting oil and
Hmm.
saying how their product
Hmm.
is clean and safe and brilliant and changes the baby's nappy and or diapers and does everything you can do.
Yes.
Um, and you're like, oh, well, you would say that. If you do the same when you hear a wind or solar promoter,
Hmm.
then that if you get nothing else out of that, I think that would be useful. So
Hmm.
when people say dirty, oh, the technologies that I disagree with are dirty and polluting. The ones that I agree with are clean and green and wonderful. Well,
Right.
of course, but is that true? You know, and so that's that's kind of what we looked at. So in terms of the history, yeah, you are right, because a lot of people do have that perception. If anybody is interested, I'd look up a guy, Professor Václav Smil, and you can probably
Hmm.
find some talks on YouTube
Yeah.
and all of this. He's written many very fascinating books and also he talks about actually, and there's others that have done this as well, but he just does a very good job, I think, of pointing out how you have um, the he points out that actually, um, up until the 50s, the age of coal only really began at the start of the 20th century. That for most countries, even in the late 19th century, they were still relying on human or animal labor for a lot of their energy needs, and it's
Hmm.
only, it was only some countries were switching to coal, but actually, then it was around 1950s that more and more shifted to oil. And then there was people looking at this saying, you know, up until the end of the 19th century and even the early 20th century, it was largely the age of wood that most of our energy, the world's
That's right.
energy, was
Right.
coming from wood, which was a renewable resource. So we were switched from renewables, biomass, but we were cutting down trees left, right, and center. because
Right.
if you're it was being carried out in many cases in a non-sustainable manner, and that's actually like if
Hmm.
you take the British Isles, um, that's actually where the steam powered industrial revolution really took place, and it was partly because um, all of the forests had been hugely devastated because everybody had been
Right.
cutting down all of the trees, and they still needed
Yeah.
fuel. So people started using coal. They said, "Oh, we can burn coal. We can use coal for heating." And then, in order to try and get coal, uh, they they were digging it from these coal mines, but they were going deeper and deeper down, and the mines were becoming flooded overnight because they were going below the
Yes.
water table. So, in order to get the coal that was below the water table, the workers had to spend hours emptying out, bucketing out water, and then start mining. So, I what's the steam engine? Well, the steam
Means
engine
what?
was actually a but it was originally I think it was Newcastle. Anyway, there's the thing, but it was originally
Yeah.
developed um, in order to drain the mines
The
of
water.
water to of the water so that people could start
Yeah.
digging it so that they could get coal for um, for heating purposes as a fuel instead of timber, instead of wood.
Yeah.
Then they realized we could actually power the whole thing using the coal. And then eventually, over like several decades, the penny dropped that, hey, don't we use this instead of like horse powered and animal powered, and it switched to steam powered, and then you had so the British um
Yeah.
started having these steam engines, and then of course at the time the British Empire was a quarter of the world, so they
Right.
started putting railways here, and then of course the US also became very much into it. um, so uh, what you were saying.
For the sake of time,
Yeah, okay.
may I try to just kind
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah,
bring
yeah,
that to a
yeah, yeah, yeah,
climax
yeah,
here.
yeah. Please.
Namely, the Industrial Revolution in some parts of the world was
Yeah,
done by the early
yeah,
1900s, but in some parts of the
yeah.
world, it hasn't even begun yet.
Exactly,
And
exactly.
those parts of the world need very, very inexpensive, very, very abundant, very, very reliable energy. Every part of the world always needs reliable energy, especially the
Yeah,
most industrialized parts, because a blackout
yeah,
in a place that is heavily technology dependent
yeah,
is really, really disastrous. But all of
yeah,
the world needs abundant, affordable, reliable energy. And
yeah,
just to say, well, coal, oil, natural gas, those powered the Industrial Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution is over. No, that's historically pretty myopic.
yeah.
Well, still though, proponents of a zero carbon global energy system insist that we make a rapid transition to wind and solar generated electricity. Environmental policy groups, advocacy groups like Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion get massive media attention around the world, prompting policymakers to shift in the direction through, for example, here in the United States, the Green New Deal. And a lot of people think anyone who opposes these policies is ignorant or doesn't care about the environment, or is bought off by the fossil fuel companies. Well, how do you respond to that? And in particular, did any fossil fuel companies help pay for the research that went into your article?
Well, the last question, no, definitely no. As I
Okay.
mentioned, up until 2018, I was working entirely funded. I was doing all of this research as a hobby. We set up the Ceres group, Ceres Science. So we're relying on the donations from different people. And if anybody wants to donate, if any of you watching there, if they've
Yeah.
like $5 or 100, or this is this is important for keeping this going, because also we want to try and
Hmm.
expand the group, and try and build up so that we can get more work done. But like, yeah, you can't we can do so if you go to ceres-science.com, if you're interested in what we're doing.
Yeah.
You mentioned about like Extinction Rebellion and Greenpeace, and I probably should mention that 2 years ago I was like involved in it. We wrote a report. This was with one of the co-founders of Greenpeace,
Mm.
Dr. Patrick Moore.
Patrick Moore,
So a group of us, yeah, we wrote a
friend
report
of
in
mine.
which we looked. Yes, okay. So he's a very smart guy, and what is so passionate about what he has done, and pure. Uh, he does what he believes. You know, he'll say the stuff. That's why he co-founded
Yeah.
Greenpeace, and that's why he left it as well, because he has to go with what his heart is saying and what the right thing to do
Yeah.
is. But
Yeah.
I would recommend, if anybody has the time, you can again find it on my RonanConnollyScience.com website, a link to a report that we did on Greenpeace's business model. And one of the things we point out, I don't want to be specifically attacking Greenpeace, but they are emblematic of it. And we were doing this
Mm-hmm.
specifically because we had insights into the Greenpeace model, partly through Patrick Moore's connections, and also the Greenpeace had actually been publishing all of their reports, and we had access to a lot of the information. And what they one of the things that they do, you have to remember that Greenpeace is a fundraising group. So they come up with campaigns. They want campaigns, and their average length of time it takes their for a campaign to raise funds is several years. And so there's a lot of build up in order to try and gain momentum behind it. So they
Mm-hmm.
are if they, because they've happened this a couple of times, when they do a campaign that is easily implemented, then everyone says, great, we'll do that. And then their job is done, and the campaign is dead in the water. And so they have actually realized that if they want their campaigns to be successful, they have to be ones that feel like they should be implemented and that they're easy, that they
Yeah.
resonate with you and they feel sensible. But important that they will never actually be implemented, because if they are ever implemented, then that particular campaign is gone, which is very cynical.
Right.
I like I,
Right. Yeah.
but that seems to be the MO that they have been adapting. And
Yeah.
so when they say wind and solar, in particular, I will say, we mentioned this in this Greenpeace report. What we point out is they will say things like, we can transition to 100 renewable from wind, solar, etc. Or they'll sometimes say wind, solar, tidal, etc. And the etc. is never given. You're assuming that they've loads of these other things, but they're not. They don't have the etc. And in fact, Greenpeace are actively campaigning against biomass, biofuels, hydroelectricity,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
all of the
Nuclear.
also nuclear, also transitioning from coal and oil to gas. They have this keep it in the ground. And just for your viewers, because I know we're running out
That's
of
right.
time, but um, the average CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour from gas is only about 40%. It varies, but about 40% of coal and oil. So if
Right.
reducing CO2 was a major priority for you, and for any policymakers, and you're like, we need to reduce CO2 immediately as quickly as possible. If you were to transition all of your coal and oil to gas,
Right.
you would reduce you don't more than halve the electricity, the CO2 emissions from electricity. If you were to
Yeah.
switch to
Yeah.
nuclear, you'd almost entirely get rid of from the
Yeah.
electricity sector. but those are actual solutions.
Yeah.
So they're
Well, very
opposed.
good. Yeah. Okay. Um, and in some of our earlier programs, we've discussed the difference between dispatchable and non-dispatchable, or intermittent and
Right.
non-intermittent energy sources. And I'd
Yeah.
actually hoped to talk about that with you a bit today, but we are running out of time. So I want to jump from that as a significant problem with wind and solar
Yeah.
to something that you mentioned in your article that is not very frequently brought up, and that is that wind, solar, and other renewable energy sources can threaten biodiversity. That's something you
Yeah.
don't hear very often. How do they do
Yeah.
that?
Well, okay. So I think each of the technologies, it's for slightly different
Hmm.
reasons. So
Hmm.
I like the most obvious is probably biomass and biofuels, because if you recall, we were talking about how in the past the British Isles was relying on wood, biomass,
Yeah,
and
right.
for their energy, and then they realized that they
Hmm.
had this power dense coal that was effectively ancient plants from millions of years ago. It was ancient compressed biomass. So if
Right.
you want to switch from this coal back to biomass, or switching from oil to biofuels, then you are actually automatically getting rid of that power density thing that helped us get
Hmm.
from a population of 1 billion to 7.8 billion or whatever we're at now. So if you want to switch, say we're getting rid of coal and oil and we're going back to biomass and biofuel, the ones we had back when we were 1 billion, and we were already causing major deforestation, well, what happens is you end up you will switch, increase it. So this has actually been, there was actually a very important article or analysis in New York Times magazine, and I think the reference is in the paper
Hmm.
if people are interested.
Hmm.
This was more than a year ago, where a journalist went and noticed that um, in Borneo, there has been huge deforestation. Borneo in Indonesia, and the
Yeah.
rainforests there are being cut down in order to grow palm oil. Now, Greenpeace, of course,
Yes.
are blaming that on the Western's decadent ways of all of the consumerism that we use. Fair enough, but actually, in that New York Times magazine article, they said, "Hang on, this is in order to meet EU and US mandates to increase the
That's right.
percentage of biofuel and biodiesel, bioethanol and biodiesel in our transport interest." So when you go to the gas pump and it says contains 5% or 10%, but ethanol or bio, or the diesel contains biodiesel, what you're doing is, where is that coming from? Well, one of the main sources of biodiesel is palm oil from the Borneo regions, and so if you are and I have sympathy for the farmers in Borneo that are being told, look, if you grow, if you get all of this palm oil, you have a guaranteed market for the EU and the US, because they are trying to stop climate change by putting this into their trucks and lorries and cars. And so they're like, okay, well, we have here all of this land from the old jungle. Why don't we cut it down and
Yep.
get
Yeah.
and grow more palm oil? And this has been happening.
And a
And
result
in the
is
article,
lost biodiversity. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The result is
And
lost biodiversity. And
yeah,
similarly, for all the various different, every time you are making a choice between two different energy sources, the energy density and the power density of the source becomes very significantly important, because
yeah,
the lower the density it is, the more of that source and the more
yeah,
land necessary to acquire that source you need to
yeah,
generate the same, megawatt hours of electricity, or the same
yeah,
miles of travel of your lorry or whatever.
yeah, yeah,
The higher the energy and power density, the less land you need, the less of the source that you need. And so
yeah,
that's why the more so-called renewables tend to be more of a threat to biodiversity than the
yeah,
so-called non-renewables. And so
yeah,
it's kind of, it's intuitively backward of what we would think, because we think,
yeah,
oh, trees, they're natural, of course we'll use those for energy.
yeah,
Well, now wait a minute, they provide far less
yeah.
energy per ton than
I, I,
oil or natural gas or coal or uranium or something like that. Now,
yeah,
I'm afraid we're pretty much up at the time limit for the program. Let me ask you this: would you be willing to come on the show again and follow up, because we've only got through
yeah.
roughly half of what we had planned for today? Can we do this again?
Sure, 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 definitely. I
Okay.
just just one thing short to say, building on what you're
Quick
doing, and
closing
you,
comment.
uh, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yes, indeed.
And
Yeah,
that's it.
absolutely.
And like a lot of people, you know, that are promoting these things are doing it because they think they're doing the right thing. But you have to look at things carefully. You have to look at everything. You can't just go
Yeah,
on what you're being sold. You need to look
yeah,
at what it is.
right,
So the good
right,
intentions is not, if you're truly concerned about the environment, then it's no good just telling yourself that you are doing, that you feel that you're doing the right thing. That doesn't do anything to the environment.
right,
Yeah.
right. Well, very good. Ronan, Dr. Ronan Connolly, thank you so much for joining us on From the Stacks. We will definitely get you back on the program. We'd love to
Okay.
talk further with you about this really fascinating article. And meanwhile, friends,
Okay.
thanks so much for joining us this evening. Stay in touch with us. We'll tell you when Ronan will be on the show again, and we'll have other guests, of course, in the future. Meanwhile, well, I'll remind you, The Weaponization of Weather and the Phony Climate War is a brand new book by Joe Bastardi. And it particularly shows how the various claims that man-made climate change is promoting more frequent and more severe extreme weather events turn out to be false when you look at the historical data. And so that particular way of trying to support the dangerous man-made global warming meme really falls apart when you look at history. We will be glad to send a free copy of The Weaponization of Weather to anyone who makes a donation of literally any size. Of course, we hope it'll be generous. Just simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and after you've finished filling out the donation, in the comments field, write weaponization of weather and promo code 20 10, and we'll send you a free copy. 100% of your gift will be tax deductible. So until next time, thanks very much for tuning in. God bless you, and God be with you.